All right, now, the next major topic that you and I have to discuss is working with selections inside Photoshop. And, you know, selections is really one of these big topics in Photoshop. I would say that the ability to be able to select objects inside your images is probably one of the more important topics inside Photoshop, because once you have an area selected or an object selected, then you can do stuff to it. You can apply special effects to it, you can remove it, you can move it around inside the photo, you can apply some color correction to it, about a billion other things that you can do to it. But it's all about getting that initial selection, and that's really what the next little while is going to be all about here. So let's go and open up the project file that you and I will be using for the next while. So once again, go ahead and double click on that gray background, or you can choose File Open if you wish. And inside your project files folder, we have a file called selections.psd right there. Go ahead and pop this guy open. Now, you're going to think I'm a little nuts for using this file here, because it just looks like a bunch of junk, doesn't it? But I found all this stuff, by the way, underneath my workbench in the garage. But anyway, the idea here is I thought, you know, I really want to show all the different ways that we can go about creating selections inside Photoshop. So I'm going to show you how to create selections based on shape. I'm going to show you how to create selections by simply creating a freehand selection. We'll take a look at creating selections based on color. Lots of great stuff to show you here. So I hope you're up for all of this. Now, there's a couple of things that I want to do here before we really get rolling. I'd like you to make sure to hit the D key on your keyboard. Now, that might sound kind of strange, but just follow me on the magical mystery tour here. Just hit the D key on your keyboard. And then the other thing that I'd like to do is I would like to increase our canvas size inside our image. So head up to the image menu and then down to canvas size, or of course, again, Command Option C or Control Alt C on the Windows side. And here's what we'll do. Inside the canvas size dialog box, make sure your unit of measurement is on pixels, and I'd like you to change your width to 4,000 pixels, and then set your anchor point to the top left corner, just like this. All right, go ahead and click on OK. And what we should get, if I just zoom out here a little bit, is our pile of junk on the left and an open white canvas there on the right. So to give you a sense of what we're going to be doing here, I think what we'll do is we'll take the different pieces of material that we have here, all the washers and bolts and screws and things, and we're going to make a face out of all of these parts. And we're obviously going to need to grab these different objects, pull them off the background, and then move them around. And that's really what all this is about. And it's all about showing you the various methods for creating selections. So I hope you're up for lots of fun here. Now, what I'd like to try and do here with you is start you off on some of the more simple selection tools, and then we'll get more and more complicated as we go here. So as I say, we're going to try and make a sort of a cartoonish looking face out of all these metal parts here. There's going to be a lot of zooming in this exercise. So a lot of controller command plus and minus, or you can use your controller command space bar, this sort of thing. So I'm just going to zoom in on my metal parts here. It's one of these two washers that I'm really after. I think I'm going to go with the top one here, but you can use whichever one you want. So you might want to just zoom in a little bit on this washer. I'm going to start off with creating the face's eyes. So what we're going to do is we're going to learn how to create selections based on shape to start off with. So obviously here we have a circular shape. Now over inside the toolbox, we have some selection tools that are going to help us create selections based on shape. Hidden underneath the rectangular marquee tool, we have a tool called the elliptical marquee tool. Oftentimes I simply refer to them as the circle selection tool or the circular marquee tool. But anyway, this is the guy that we're after. So go ahead and grab this guy out of your toolbox. And essentially what we want to do is we want to click and drag out an oval with this guy, or a circle with this guy. So usually what I do is I start above and to the left of the object that I'm after, and then I click and drag. And I just kind of, quite honestly, between you and I just hope for the best. Now, as you can see, as soon as I click and drag with the tool, I get some marching ants, which is fantastic, but you can see my actual selection is off. I didn't do a very good job of trying to select this rusted metal washer. So here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to try and take another stab at it here. I'll take another run at it. So what I'll do is I'll just bring my cursor outside of my marching ants somewhere, anywhere really, and just single click, and that will get rid of the marching ants for me. So that's kind of a quick way to get rid of your selection. And then I'll simply take another run at it. So I'll simply bring my cursor back up above and to the left of my object and click and drag again. And actually, I've done a fairly good job here, which is quite surprising. Now, you know what's cool, by the way, is I haven't let go of my mouse just yet. I'm still, sort of clicking and dragging here, if you will, with the mouse. And what I'm going to do is I can hold down the space bar, and now I can move my selection as I'm creating it, which is awesome. So I can kind of position it up a little bit, maybe if it's just off a little bit. And then as soon as I let go of the space bar, I can continue dragging out my marching ants. So just kind of a neat little trick there for you. Holding down the space bar, allowing you to reposition your marching ants, and then getting your selection as best as you can. If this is your first time using this tool, you might have to take a second or a third or a fourth run at trying to select this metal washer. It can be a little bit frustrating, but try to be patient with it. You've never done it before, right? So, of course, it's going to require a little bit of practice, but hopefully you're doing an okay job there. Now, the other thing that I want to show you is this. Obviously, I don't want the center of the washer to be selected. This is background, right? I don't want that in there. So I want to show you a very cool trick for removing an area from a selection. This is a perfect case, a perfect situation where I'd want to do this. So in other words, I want to subtract out this center from my washer. How do you do that? Well, here's a neat trick that you'll want to jot down in your notes. If I hold down the Option key on the Mac or the Alt key on the Windows side, notice my cursor changes. It's now a crosshair, but now it has a tiny little minus sign, suggesting that if I click and drag, I would be subtracting from the current selection. So here's two things that I'd like you to remember. Holding down Alt or holding down Option is going to subtract from a selection. Holding down the Shift key would add to a selection. So I can always add to and subtract from the selections that I make here inside Photoshop. So you might want to jot those two little tricks down in your notes here. In the meantime, what I'm going to do is I'm going to do my best here to try and select the center area of this washer again, just by kind of coming above and to the left of the center object there anyway of my washer, and I'll click and drag out, and hopefully I'll do a half decent job here. Again, I'm using my spacebar trick to help me position things up. Now, again, mine isn't perfect, but I'm trying to do the best I can here for you. There, something like that. And as soon as I'm happy, all I'm going to do is simply let go of the Option key here on the Mac, let go of the Alt key there on the Windows side, and voila! Hopefully you have a decent looking selection here. Okay, now, the big thing. How do we now take this object and yank it off of the background and move it around inside Photoshop? Well, that's what we'll take a look at next. All right, how do we go about yanking this object off of the background and moving it around inside Photoshop? Well, I'm just going to zoom out a little bit here, Command minus or Control minus. And, what I want to make sure that you understand at this point is that our photograph here, the photograph of all the rusted metal parts, is flat. There's no depth to it, right? It's just a simple flat photograph. So as soon as I make a selection, though, I can then pull something away from the other objects inside the photo. It could be any kind of a photo that you have here. And I can move it around while I have the marching ants. As soon as I get rid of the marching ants, then it's kind of like everything reflattens, if that makes sense. So while I have a selection, the object floats on top of the photo. As soon as I get rid of the selection, everything flattens down again. Let me show you what I'm talking about. So I'm just going to zoom in just a touch here. What I'll do is I'll now switch over, I'll flip over to the Move tool just by hitting the V key on my keyboard. Of course, over on my washer there, I still have my marching ants, which is great. Well, check this out. With the Move tool now selected inside the toolbox, quite literally clicking and dragging yanks that object, that selected object, off of the background. And now this object literally, as I mentioned just a moment ago, floats over top of all of the other objects inside my image, right? Which is great, because now I can, move them around, position them where I want them. And then this is kind of the wacky part. Let's say, for example, I drop them over top of this sort of this weird sort of looking nut there, this sort of hexagonal looking nut here. If I were to get rid of the marching ants at this point, then the washer would flatten on top of the hexagonal nut. So anyway, here's what I want to do. This sort of, I don't even know what this is, a rusted sort of cylindrical object here, that's going to serve as part of our eye for our face. And the washer that you and I selected is going to be sort of the eyeball or like the iris. So what I want to do is I want to position the washer something like this on top of this wacky looking cylindrical rusted metal object. Something like this is what I'm after. I hope this makes sense. Now again, don't forget, while I still have marching ants, I can move this guy around. I can position him, right? Now what I want to do is I want to get rid of my selection. I want to deselect, if you will, because I'm happy with my positioning here, my repositioning of the washer. Now to get rid of your marching ants, there's a bunch of different things that you can do, but probably the easiest thing to do is to simply head up to the select menu and then choose deselect. Or I always use my keyboard shortcut, Command D or Control D over on the Windows side, and that gets rid of those marching ants. Now, if I try and click and drag on my washer, I can't, because you can see here Photoshop is telling me that the layer is locked. We'll talk about layers a little bit later on, but essentially everything's locked down, everything's flattened. So I no longer have that floating selection. So you want to be really careful that you've positioned your object correctly before you deselect, before you get rid of your marching ants. All right, now the next thing that I want to do is I want to grab the entire eye for our face, and I want to move them over onto the right-hand side of our document, that sort of open white blank area that you and I had created earlier. So I'm going to go back to the elliptical marquee tool over inside the toolbox, and I'm going to try and select this whole piece here, both parts here. And again, you're just kind of hoping for the best here. You click and drag, you hope for the best, you kind of cross your fingers as you're doing it here. Don't forget I can use my space bar to help me along here as I make my selection. Now, my selection is by no means perfect. I'm getting a lot of white in the selection here as well. That's fine because he's going to wind up on a white background, so it shouldn't be too bad here. But make sure you have both objects, both the rusted cylinder and the rusted metal washer. And I'll zoom back out, Command minus or Control minus. And I'll flip back over to my Move tool. And now I simply want to take this selection and drag him all the way over onto the right-hand side of the document, as I say. Something like that. All right. Now, unless you want to create a Cyclops face, which I guess you could if you wanted to, you want to have two eyes in your cartoonish face that we're making here. So what I now want to do is I want to take this guy and duplicate him. And doing so is very easy. Let me just zoom in a little bit so you can see what I'm doing here. All I'm going to do, I'm still on the Move tool, is I'm going to bring my cursor inside the selection, hold down Alt or Option, check out the cursor there. The cursor changes. It now becomes a double arrow almost, suggesting that if I click and drag, I would create a duplicate of my selection, whatever that selection might be. And that's really all there is to it. Perfect. All right. Now that we've moved the eyes over onto the right-hand side, we've duplicated the eye there, so we have two eyes. I'd like you to get rid of your marching ants. Do you remember your keyboard shortcut for getting rid of your selection? Control D or Command D. Perfect. I want to take just a quick moment and show you a very cool technique for helping you along as you are creating your selections here inside Photoshop. So we're going to take sort of a slight digression here, if you will. And I think what I'll do is I'm going to zoom in on one of the other washers that I have inside my pile of junk here, this washer here. And earlier you saw how to select an object like this using the elliptical marquee tool. Let's go back to that tool just for a second. And here's a trick that I want to show you. What I'm going to do here is I'm going to make a very sloppy selection. I'm not going to be very accurate at all. Something like this, right? And earlier you might have started to get a little bit frustrated when you were trying to select your washer, because it is tough trying to get a perfect selection. And I said earlier that you might have to take a couple of runs at it until you get a perfect selection. What I'd like you to do is purposefully make a sloppy selection like I've done here, because there's a very, very cool command inside Photoshop that's going to allow us to adjust our selections. So what I'm going to do with my sloppy selection is I'm going to head up to the Select menu here at the top. And then down towards the bottom of this menu, we have a command called Transform Selection. Go ahead and choose this guy. Now, as soon as I choose transform selection, what I get is this rectangular bounding box showing up around my marching ants. And you'll notice this guy's very similar to the crop tool, and as a matter of fact, he works in a very similar way. So I have these grab handles on the sides and in the corners, this kind of thing. And as I drag on these little handles here, you can see the marching ants, the selection inside the frame is adjusting. So all of a sudden, what I can do is I can adjust my selection to be exactly the way I need it. And you're probably sitting there going, well, why didn't you show me this, 5 minutes ago kind of thing. But anyway, I wanted to show you some of the other tricks there, the space bar and some of the other tricks there. So look at that. Perfect selection. Absolutely perfect. So come in here, you throw on a sloppy selection, you head into the select menu and then transform selection. And then you simply adjust your selection using these little handles, just like that. That's all there is to it. Now, do you remember from earlier on how to commit to a crop? Do you remember that? Well, the same keystroke would commit a transformation of our selection here as well. If you're thinking of hitting your enter key on the keyboard, you're absolutely correct. So just hit enter on your keyboard, or you could double click inside your frame. Perfect selection. Although you and I just created a perfect selection here, and we used that transform selection command inside Photoshop, sadly, don't forget that that was a digression, wasn't it? So we actually don't need this selection. I wanted to show you that transform selection tool, though. So I'm just going to minus out here, command minus out to zoom out, and I'm going to deselect command D or control D. And it's this piece of metal here, this curved piece of metal that I'm now after. What I want to try and do is I want to try and select this guy, obviously. So I'm going to zoom in on him, this fella right here. Now, when I'm making selections inside Photoshop, and usually it's, objects and photos, birds or cars or people or whatever. But whatever it is that I'm trying to select, I always run through my different options in my head. It's almost like a process of elimination that I use anyway. So I look at something like this and I go, all right, could I use my elliptical marquee tool, the tool that you and I have been using up until this point, to select this object? Well, no, not really. It's not really a circular shape. Even though it's curved, it's not really a circle, is it? And then I go, all right, well, could I use my rectangular marquee tool? Well, no, I couldn't use that guy either. I go, oh, all right, well, what else could I do here? Well, we haven't talked yet about the lasso tools. We have the freehand lasso tool, the polygonal lasso tool, and then we also have the magnetic lasso tool. I suppose one of these guys might work on something like this, but I want to show you another tool called the magic wand tool. And what I like so much about the magic wand tool is he creates selections based on color. And you'll find your magic wand tool kind of buried inside your toolbox, hidden underneath the quick selection tool. And the quick selection tool is a very cool tool. We'll get to him in just a little while. So make sure you flip over to your magic wand tool. Now, as I say, this guy creates selections based on color. So for example, maybe I want to select a red shirt that someone's wearing, or a blue car that's in the background, or something like this, right? Or in my case, a rusted metal object. Here's what I'm going to do. I'm simply going to bring my cursor maybe over here somewhere, and I'll try single clicking on my object. And you can see that part of the object gets selected. Now, you might have a slightly different selection than I have here, but I definitely have marching ants, but I definitely didn't get the entire object either. So let me show you how this guy works here, how he selects color. What I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and deselect, get rid of my marching ants for a second here. So you can use your keyboard shortcut. We're going to do a lot of deselecting here in the next while. So Control D or Command D to get rid of your marching ants. And have a look at your options bar up across the top of your screen. And notice that we have a tolerance field here. Now what the tolerance value does is controls how much color gets selected. So in other words, if I have a very high tolerance and I click on a light blue, then all light blues, mid blues, and dark blues would all be selected. If I lower the tolerance and I click on a light blue, only light blues would be selected. I'm kind of simplifying it here for you, but that's kind of the idea. So I want to experiment a little bit with the tolerance setting here, and I'll show you how this impacts our selection. So my tolerance right now is actually quite high. It's at 60. I'll bet you yours is at the default, which is 32. But what I'd like you to do here is select your tolerance value and drop it down to just 10. and then hit enter on your keyboard to lock in that change. And then come back down to this curved piece of metal here and try to click in roughly the same spot that you clicked in previously. Try single clicking. And you can see I get this tiny, paltry selection here. No good at all. So that's what lowering the tolerance does. I'm going to deselect once again, Control D or Command D. Let's go and change our tolerance now to, let's try 50. I'm going to bring mine all the way up to 50, enter. And again, try and click on roughly the same area there if you can. All right, now we get an even larger selection, don't we? A much better selection than you and I just got previously, right? Okay, that's fantastic. That's great. All right, let's try this one more time. I'm going to deselect again. Control D or Command D. Head back up to the tolerance value up on the options bar. And let's try bringing this guy up to 60 and then enter on your keyboard. And then again, roughly in the same spot here, let's try single clicking and you'll get an even larger selection. Do you see how that works? Now, what you might want to do is you may want to pause the video and try cranking your tolerance even higher and see if you can get an even better selection. But you know what I'm going to do here is I'm going to leave my selection as it is, even though I don't have the entire object. You'll notice I'm still missing a couple of pieces of my object here. You might have a few other extra pieces missing out of your object. Because I want to show you another cool trick, and this perhaps will remind you of a neat trick I mentioned earlier. Earlier, you saw how to subtract from a selection by holding down Alt or Option, and I mentioned that you could hold down Shift to add to a selection, right? So that's exactly what I'm going to do here. I'm going to hold down the Shift key and then click on the little holes that I see inside my selection. So I clicked once there, that grabbed that guy, and it actually took out another area that I had there, and then I just have this tiny little spot left here. Just holding down Shift and clicking on those little spots there adds them into the selection. Perfect. So I hope you have a nice, decent selection there. There's how to create selections based on color using the Magic Wand tool. I'm sure you're going to find lots and lots of uses for the Magic Wand tool. Okay, now the million-dollar question. We've got them selected, right? We have this object selected. Now what are we going to do with them? Well, next up, I want to show you yet another new command, a command called Free Transform. Okay, we've got this guy selected. Now what? Well, let me show you this thing called Free Transform. I think you're really going to like this command. So I'm going to zoom out here. Once again, Command minus or Control minus there on the Windows side is just fine. And I'm going to switch over to my Move tool. I'll just hit the V key on my keyboard. And I'm going to take this little piece here and, of course, drag them over onto the face that we're slowly creating over on the right hand side. And let me just quickly remind you again that we've got this floating selection, right? So we can move them around and position them up where we want. As soon as we get rid of the marching ants, of course, that's going to flatten everything down. It kind of collapses down your object onto your image. I'm just going to zoom in a little bit here. Now, what I was thinking is that this little curved piece of metal here could be our face's eyebrows. That's what I had in mind anyway. But unless I want to have an angry face, a pouty face, what I need to do is I need to flip this object around 180 degrees, right? So how am I going to do that? Well, again, that's what this command called Free Transform is going to let us do. It's going to let us take an object like this and rotate it around, scale it up and down, all kinds of crazy stuff. Find your Free Transform command, by the way, underneath your Edit menu. So head up to the Edit menu, and then I guess about halfway down, look for Free Transform, or once again, here's another keyboard shortcut that you'll definitely want to try and remember. Command T here on the Mac or Control T there on the Windows side, and that will get you into the Free Transform. Now, the Free Transform command gives you a frame around your selection, just like the Crop tool, and just like that Transform Selection command that we saw not too long ago. And just like those other two commands, the Free Transform command works exactly the same way. So if I drag on the corners, now what happens is I scale the size of the object. So maybe I want this object to be super huge, or maybe I want it to be, super tiny, or maybe I want to make it taller or wider, or maybe I want to rotate it around. I can do that just by bringing my cursor outside of the frame and then clicking and dragging, something like this, right? You can do all kinds of crazy stuff. But, now what's happened here is I've totally distorted the object. I've totally messed it up. And what I want to do is I want to back out of everything that I've done. So what I'm going to do here is I'll hit escape on my keyboard. And what that does is that gets rid of the free transform frame, and it takes me all the way back to where you and I started. So if you've messed around a little bit with your free transform, hit escape. That'll take you all the way back out. And then you and I can go back into the free transform again, just by using that keyboard shortcut if we like Control T or Command T, and then we can start over. So maybe what I'll do here is I want to make this piece into the eyebrow, obviously. So I want to make them a little bit bigger. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to hold down the Shift key and drag on a corner. And what that will do, holding down Shift there, is that will prevent the object from getting distorted. In other words, it'll keep that width and height ratio in check, if that makes sense. So you might want to scale them up a little bit. And I also said that I wanted to rotate them around. So I'm just going to simply flip them around like this, just by dragging on the outside of the frame. Something like that, maybe. Next up, what I'll do is I'll simply move them up above the eyes, maybe something like that, or above one of the eyes there. If you want to add in maybe a little bit of character, you might want to tilt it just a little bit to give them a little bit of expression, something like that, maybe. Maybe I'll just kind of crush them down a little bit, maybe something like that. I think that looks pretty good to me. What do you think? I think it looks good. I'm going to hit enter to lock in that change. Again, just like the crop tool, just like the transform selection tool that we saw earlier. And then I'm going to duplicate this guy out. We want two eyebrows, right? So again, holding down Alt or Option, and all I'm going to do is click and drag on this object to create a copy. Something like that. Fantastic. Okay, get rid of your selection, get rid of your marching ants. Control D or Command D. Okay, the next thing that our face needs here is a mouth. So let's go and set up a mouth for this guy. I'm just going to hold down my space bar and drag over to the left-hand side, over to our miscellaneous pieces of rusted metal. And this sort of hexagonal-looking nut is what I'm after here. So you might want to zoom in on this guy, Command plus or Control plus there just a little bit. In terms of selecting this guy, let's sort of cycle through our options. Can I use the elliptical selection tool? Well, obviously no, that's not going to work, and the rectangular selection tool is not going to work either. How about the magic wand? Well, you know, you could try the magic wand. I'm not sure if that would work or not, but what I'm going to try and do is I want to start using my lasso tools. And of course we see our lasso tools over inside the toolbox. Now, I suppose you could try your regular lasso tool, or what I call the freehand lasso tool. And with this guy, what we would do essentially is just try and sort of freehand a selection all the way around this guy. And as you can see, I'm doing quite a terrible job of this. So this isn't really happening for me here. So I'm just going to get rid of my marching ants here just by hitting Command D or Control D. Instead, I think what I'll try is my polygonal lasso tool. So go ahead and grab that fella. And this guy is going to create for us straight-edged selections, which is fantastic. You might want to zoom in just a little bit more on your object here. And I think what I'll do is I'll just start up maybe in the top left corner here. Just a single click, by the way. And you'll notice that I now have this little string connected to my cursor from the starting point there now to my cursor. And it's going to follow me around, right? So the idea here is to maybe come along down the edge, maybe about here, and then I'll single click there. And that puts in sort of an angle there, or a corner, if you will. And then I'll just kind of make my way around the edge of this object here, maybe something like this. Now, you know, your selection doesn't have to be perfect. The idea here is just getting used to this tool here, the polygonal lasso tool. What's kind of cool too is once you make your way down an edge, you can hold down the space bar and then reposition your screen. And then as soon as you let go of your space bar, you're onto this tool. All right, so now what I'll do is I'll obviously just sort of continue along the edge of my object, just single clicking wherever I think the selection edge should change direction. And again, you know, it doesn't have to be perfect. You might want to shave off a little bit of the object. That's just fine. And let's see, I'll come up the side here. Something like this. This tool here, the polygonal lasso tool, is fantastic for objects that have these sort of these hard edges. And again, I'm not doing the greatest job in the world, but again, the idea here is to get you used to working with the tool. And all these lumps here along the top, I suppose I could go around them, but you know, I'm just going to kind of trim them all off, something like that, just to kind of smooth it out a little bit anyway. All right, now for the moment of truth. The way that I'm going to close off my selection or finish off my selection is just by bringing my cursor over top of the starting point. And when I do so, I get a little donut right beside my cursor there. I don't know if you can see that or not. That indicates that I'm about to close my selection. And if I single click, voila, marching ants, right? Okay, perfect. So I hope that worked out for you. Zoom out here a little bit. Now we have the problem of getting rid of the center of the nut or the center of the object, right? Any ideas there? Maybe I should get you to pause the video and ponder this for a moment. Any ideas for knocking away the center of this object? Well, I could grab my elliptical marquee tool and try and select out that center, sort of like we did with our rusty washer earlier on. I'm going to do something similar to that, sort of the same idea, but hopefully it'll go a little faster. I'm going to use my magic wand tool, so I'll head over to the toolbox and I'll grab my magic wand tool. And then what I want to do is essentially get the magic wand tool to knock out the center. Don't forget that the magic wand tool creates selections based on color. The center area of the object is essentially the same color. So I'm going to hold down Option here on the Mac or Alt on the Windows side. You'll see your cursor changes to the magic wand tool with the minus beside it, suggesting that if I single click, I then knock away that center portion. Perfect. Okay, great. Let's move this guy over onto our face. I'll hit the V key on my keyboard to switch back to my move tool, and I'll just zoom out here a little bit, Command minus, Control minus there on the Windows side, grab the object, and literally tear him away, pull him off of his background, and move him onto the face. Something like this. Okay. Now, it's entirely up to you how you want to set this up. You might want to leave yourself a little bit of space, something like this, or you might want to crowd it in a little bit. I'm thinking of putting a nose in here, so you might want to leave a little bit of space there. And the other thing I wanted to mention as well is you may want to use your free transform to rotate this guy's mouth around a little bit. So don't forget our keyboard shortcut for free transform was Command T or Control T, and then I can just rotate this guy around. So maybe something more like that for myself. Of course, with your free transform, you can make this object larger or smaller, whatever you like there. I'm going to hit Enter to lock in my change, and then deselect, Command D or Control D. Okay, I just said a second ago that I wanted to put a nose into my face, right between the eyes, obviously, and the mouth there. This gives me a great opportunity to show you a very cool technique inside Photoshop, which essentially allows us to combine selection tools. So in other words, using two selection tools to select an object. So let me show you what I'm talking about. I'm just going to hold down my spacebar and I'll pan over a little bit into our pile of junk here. I suppose you could use the bolts that you see towards the sort of the top right there. Some of them have some rusted nuts on the end of them. I'm going to go with this guy though myself. He's down towards the bottom. I'm just going to zoom in on this. Now, what's cool about this guy is he has a combination of straight edges and also curved edges. So the sort of the threading, I guess you could say, on the bolt or the ribbing there is curved. And then we have some straight edges as well. So what I want to show you how to do is I want to show you how to work with both the Polygonal Lasso tool and the freehand Lasso tool both at the same time. So here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to start off on the Polygonal Lasso tool, so make sure you have him activated inside the toolbox. Might want to zoom in a little bit or position up your screen so that you are comfortable. Maybe I'll zoom in just a little bit more, something like this. And myself, I'm going to start in the bottom right corner of the object, and what I'll do is I'll single click here to get started, and of course we get that string there attached to our cursor, and maybe what I'll do is I'll just kind of single click my way up the right hand side, and then let me just click one more time here and then across this sort of straight edge here. Again, it doesn't have to be perfect. Don't, stress yourself out here or anything. Okay, something like that. And then I'll just come up the right side here just a little bit, right to the point where the threading begins, right? And don't forget, we can hold down our space bar and reposition here if we like. So right to that point where the threading begins. Now, here's what I'd like you to do. hold down Option on the Mac here, or Alt on the Windows side, and try clicking and dragging. And what happens with your cursor, and this is the bizarro part, is as soon as you start clicking and dragging, your cursor changes to the freehand lasso tool. Now, this might require a little bit of practice to really master. So in other words, what I'm holding down here right now, and my fingers are cramping up as I'm talking to you here, but I have the Option key held down, or Alt on the Windows side, and my mouse button held down too. And I just kind of jerked my mouse there a little bit, which is too bad. I kind of messed up my selection there. But anyway, so I'm holding down Option or Alt and my mouse, and off I go all the way up the right-hand side, all the way up the threading of the bolt here, all the way up to the bottom of the nut here. Okay. Now, once I get to the nut, obviously I'm back to straight angles, right? So check this out. I'm going to let go of the Option key. I'm going to let go of my mouse, and now I'm back to the polygonal lasso tool. Did you catch that? Okay, now, if you didn't catch it, I'll have lots of opportunity to show you this a few more times because we have a long way to go here. So I'm back on the polygonal lasso tool. I'll come across the nut maybe to about here, and then again, just sort of continuing up the right-hand side of the object, something like this. I'll use my spacebar here to reposition, something like this, all the way back to the threading or the ribbing, right? All right, now we want to switch back now to the lasso tool, the freehand lasso tool, right? So what I'll do is I'll hold down Option, and then I'll click and hold with my mouse and drag. And now I'm back on that freehand lasso tool. This trick comes in really handy, not just when you're making rusty robot faces, but also in the real world when you're trying to select an object on your, out of a photo or something like this. Okay, I'm all the way back to the top of the bolt here. I'm going to let go of Option or let go of Alt there if you're on the Windows side. Let go of my mouse. Thank goodness, because I was running out of mouse pad there. Now I can literally pick up and move my mouse here. Okay, now across the top of the object. Just a few single clicks ought to do it for you. All the way over to the left-hand side now. All right, now this shouldn't be too bad. There are some bumpy spots, but I might kind of fudge it here a little bit with you. I'm going to hold down Option, and then I'll click and drag. And maybe I should pick up the pace here a little bit because I think by now you're probably getting the feel of it. All right, so again, Option or Alt and click and drag all the way down back to the nut. I'll let go of both of my fingers actually, Option or Alt off of the keyboard and my mouse. Back to the polygonal lasso tool. Let's reposition things here just by holding down the spacebar. And are you getting it? Is it making sense? Again, if you're having some trouble, don't feel bad because it took me forever to really master this. And now I use it all the time. It just takes a little bit of time to really get the hang of it. And if you've got it, hey, awesome stuff. Let's go and finish this guy off here. So again, Option or Alt and click and drag. Now there aren't too many lumps here on the left-hand side going down towards the bottom here. So we'll just kind of speed things up here a little bit. Let go of both of your fingers, back onto the polygonal lasso tool, down the left side, all the way down. Something like this. All right, we are almost done here. Across the bottom. Now it's easy stuff, right? All right, back over the starting point. I don't know if you can see that in there or not, but the little donut is appearing beside my cursor. Single click to close the selection. Let's go and finish this guy off. I'm going to zoom out here, Command minus or Control minus, and I'll flip over to my Move tool, V on the keyboard, drag this guy over, and drop him right onto my face, something like this. I'll zoom in a little bit so you can see what I have here. It's up to you. If you want to use your free transform, Control T or Command T here on the Mac, go for it. Maybe you want to flip the nose around. Maybe you want to make it a little smaller. Maybe you want to make it a little crooked. I don't know, whatever you want. I think I'm going to leave mine the way it is, though. I will deselect Control D or Command D, and there you go. There's a neat way to combine selection tools. There's a third lasso tool that I haven't mentioned just yet. He's called the magnetic lasso tool, and you'll find him buried underneath the set of lasso tools there. There he is right there down at the bottom. I think you'll really like this guy too, because what he'll do is he'll create a selection, or he'll help you create a selection, by trying to detect high contrast edges. For example, the white background and the edge of a rusted object, right? That's sort of a high contrast edge. And the magnetic lasso tool is going to try and find those high contrast edges. So go ahead and grab your magnetic lasso tool out of the toolbox. What we're going to do is we're going to try and make some ears for this guy on both sides of his face, obviously. So what I'll do here, I'm just going to pan over one more time into our pile of stuff here. And it's this sort of L-shaped bracket that I'm after. I think that would make a half-decent ear. So I'm just going to zoom in a little bit on this bracket here. And the way that you work with this guy is he's really, really easy to work with. All I'm going to do is I'm going to pick a starting point, maybe on the right-hand side over here somewhere. And all I'm going to do is just single click with the mouse. That's it. And then all I have to do is simply move my mouse. I'm not clicking and dragging. All I'm doing is I'm moving my mouse along this high contrast edge. Again, the edge of the object, obviously, here. And it's a high contrast edge because there's such a dramatic difference between the darkness of the object, the dark pixels in the object, and the white background. If you have a situation where maybe it's a person or a car or some kind of another object on, a solid colored background, a light background, and the object itself or the person is fairly dark, then this could be an option for you. And once again, all I'm doing is just moving my mouse all the way along. Now, what's kind of cool is as I'm moving my mouse along the edge of the object here, again, at any time, I can just hold down the space bar, and that'll toggle me to the hand tool. And I'll just move my object over a little bit here, and then I'll just kind of keep going here along the edge of the object. The other thing that I wanted to show you as well is as you're going along, it's pretty easy to do here. What you may want to do is you might come to a point in your object where you do want to make sure that there's a selection node. You'll notice if you look back on the trail that I've kind of left here, there's some tiny dots, some tiny points. And what I can do is I can force the magnetic lasso tool to drop one of these points just by single clicking. So perhaps you're coming into an area where the contrast drops a little bit. Well, then you can start single clicking with this guy, almost like the polygonal lasso tool. So anyway, hopefully all good here. All right, so I'm headed down the left-hand side of the object here. I'm just going to hold down my space bar and kind of continue on here all the way around the object. Now, what I'm going to do here with you is I'm going to speed it up a little bit because I want to show you a few other neat tricks. Now, what's interesting to note, though, is when I come across the bottom of the object, we have a shadow from the flash on my camera. Could try and get across that shadow, and to my great surprise, actually, it looks like the magnetic lasso tool is smart enough. It still sees that high contrast edge there, which is really good. But, if you wound up grabbing some of that shadow, don't worry about it. I'm going to show you a really cool trick in just a moment for carving away that shadow there. Again, the result of my camera flash. All right, we are getting there. I'm going to really kind of zip along here, if that's all right with you, because I think you're getting the idea here. So I'm just going to continue along here. I am going to grab the shadow in this situation, though, or in this little part here. I think there's like a little bolt head or something going through the bracket there. Anyway, so I'm just over top of that. And you'll notice there, if I just move my eye back on my little trail a little bit, it grabbed some of the background there. We're going to fix that. We're going to clean that stuff up in just a second. Because the magnetic lasso tool does a great job, but sometimes, it goofs up, or sometimes the selection isn't perfect. That's okay. I'm going to show you how to create some perfect selections in just a second here. Okay, all the way back over to the starting point. Again, I get the donut beside my cursor. I will single click, and that will finish off my selection and convert it to marching ants, which is great. So there's a look at the magnetic lasso tool, albeit a very brief look. Now, the next thing that we'll do is we'll tidy up our selection. We'll get rid of the drop shadow areas that we went and grabbed. We'll get rid of the background there as well, and you'll see how to do that next. All right, how are we going to get rid of the drop shadow, and how are we going to get rid of that extra little piece of background that we have in there? Well, you know, we already know that holding down Shift will add to a selection, and we also know that holding down Option here on the Mac, or of course Alt on the Windows side, will subtract from a selection. You've seen that a couple of times already with the Elliptical marquee tool, as I recall, and also the Magic Wand tool and so on. So here's what I'm going to do with you. I'm going to switch over to the freehand lasso tool. So go ahead and grab that guy out of the toolbox. And I think what I'll do here is I'll just kind of quickly move my eye along the edge of my selection. There's another little goof up there if I zoom in a little bit closer, where my selection isn't quite perfect. So what I want to do in this situation is that little piece of background in there. I don't know if you can see that or not. Maybe I should zoom in even closer. There we go. There's just a little bit of it in there. What I want to do is I want to cut that away. So I want my marching ants to come down and then across. And once again, this is one of these things that may take a little bit of practice, but I'm sure you'll get the hang of it. Here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to make sure my cursor is on the outside of my selection. So this is the inside, this is the outside. How do I know? When my cursor's on the outside, I see the lasso tool. When my cursor's on the inside, it changes to the white arrow, right? So make sure you're on the outside. Hold down Option or hold down Alt. You'll see the minus sign appear beside your cursor. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to start on the outside of the selection, and I'm going to click and drag into the selection, across that selection border, if you will, and cut in, and then come all the way back out the other side. Something like that. So I'm just kind of scalloping in on my selection, if you will. I let go of my cursor, and that's what I get. I just kind of carved away that little piece of selection there. Did you see that there? Let me do that a few more times here for you. I'm just going to pan down a little bit here. Here's the piece of background that we had beside that bolt head. I'll zoom out here so you know where I am. Right in here, that little piece right in there. Okay, so what I want to do is I want to essentially do the same thing, just sort of on a slightly larger scale. So again, this is the technique that I use and that I've used for years and years, and it seems to work great. So what I'm going to do, once again, my cursor's on the outside of the selection. It's not a white arrow, it's the lasso tool. I'm going to hold down Option or Alt on the Mac side here, and then I'll click and cut in on the selection. Cut in around the edge of the object, something like this, and then back out. So I'm in and then I'm out. Let go of my mouse, let go of my keyboard, and that's the result that I get. How's that working out for you? So really now all I'm going to do is I'm going to essentially do the same thing for the shadow that I see sort of behind the object. I'll start off with this big guy here. There's a big shadow below that bolt head. And this is going to be a big one. So here's what I'm going to do. It doesn't really matter which side you start on, the right side or over on the left side. It doesn't really matter. I'm going to hold down Alt or Option, and I'll cut in on my selection. And then what I'm doing here is I'm trying to carefully trace along the top of this object. Now, I'm not doing the greatest job, but hopefully you get the idea here. All the way along and all the way out the other side. Okay, now, once you're at the other side, here's what I want you to do. Come down and loop back all the way back over to where you started, something like that. And that should do the job. That should cut away that hunk of selection, if you will. And essentially what I could do here is if I'm not really happy with, my rough edge here, I could continue along here, holding down Option or holding down Alt, carving in and kind of cleaning up this selection just a little bit. Now, let me show you a cool trick here. If I wind up carving in too much and I take too much selection away, maybe something like that. Oops, I didn't mean to do that. How can I fix that? Well, essentially you and I are going to do the exact same thing, just in reverse. So this time what I'll do is I'll make sure my cursor's on the inside of the selection. I'm going to hold down Shift now, and of course Shift adds to the selection as indicated by the plus beside my cursor. And now what I'm going to do is I'm starting on the inside. I'm going to click and drag out of the selection, across the top of that bolt, and then back in. Something like this. Let go of my keyboard and mouse, and that's the result that I get. So using Option, you can cut in. Using Shift, you can cut out on your selections. And these are great tricks to know to help you get better and better selections here inside Photoshop. I said a while ago that one of the big things in Photoshop is, the ability to create really, really good selections. So this is all part of the learning process here. Here I'm just doing the exact same thing that we had done earlier. I started on the outside, held down Alt or Option, cut in, and now I'm just looping around back over to the starting point. Something like that. Perfect. All right, so I hope you got the hang of it. I hope you spend a little bit of time practicing that. What I'm going to do myself, though, is I'm going to go and move this guy over onto our face. So I've zoomed out, I hit the V key on my keyboard, and I'll grab this guy, tear him away, and move him over onto the face. I think some free transform is going to be in order here. Command T or Control T there on the Windows side. There, something like this. All right, now I want to show you something cool here. I'm just going to shrink this guy down a little bit here. I want to show you something really neat here. We need two ears, right? But they need to be flipped, right? In other words, if I hit Enter to lock this guy in, and then I go and duplicate the ear, well, we're going to have two left ears, right? Or I guess it would be his right ear, right? So next what I'll do is I'll show you a really cool technique for flipping an object. All right, we carved out our ear, we dragged him over onto our face. Now the trick is we need two ears and we need one of them to be flipped. So I'm still on my move tool, by the way. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and duplicate this guy just by holding down Alt or Option, of course, and then dragging out to duplicate. This is what I mean. So now what we need to do is we need to take this copy and flip them, right? Almost like a mirror flip, if you will. Thankfully, it's really easy to do here in Photoshop. What I'm going to do, I still have my marching ants. I haven't deselected. That's incredibly important. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to head up to the Edit menu and then down to Transform. Now, underneath the Transform menu, we have all kinds of different options. We've got scaling and rotating and skewing and perspective and warp. There's all kinds of cool stuff. But sadly, we're not going after anything too crazy here. All we want is flip horizontal. So go ahead and choose that guy, and we will now get a flipped object, something like this. And then all I'll do is just sort of position them up, something like that. I think that looks okay. Deselect, Command D or Control D. That's all there is to it. So once again, your transform commands are all underneath the Edit menu and then underneath the Transform submenu. Now, you've seen a lot. You've seen a lot of different tricks and a lot of different techniques for creating selections. I've run you through all kinds of different selection tools. Not to dump more on you, but there's even more in terms of the selection capabilities of Photoshop. Some stuff which we'll get into in just a little while. But I thought I would show you just a few other neat tricks, a few other neat techniques that I think you should really keep in mind as you're working on your images inside Photoshop, in terms of selecting, of course. What I want to do is I want to select this massive L-shaped bar way over on the left-hand side of the image. So I'm just going to zoom in on this guy. And as always, what I would do anyway is I would run through my options. Okay, well, can I use the elliptical marquee tool? No. Can I use the rectangular selection tool? Well, no, not really. How about the magic wand? How about the lasso tools? And so on, right? Now, what I want to do here, though, is I actually do want to use my rectangular selection tool. And what I want to do is I want to try and, again, combine multiple tools together. And I'll bet you that we'll have this object selected in just a couple of steps. So here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to grab my rectangular marquee tool out of the toolbox. I will click and drag a box or a rectangle around sort of the length of the bar, something like this. Okay, that's fine. And then what I want to do is I want to drag out a second rectangle just to grab this little end piece here. So I'm going to hold down Shift because I want to add to my selection, right? And I'll just kind of grab a little piece, something like that. Okay, perfect. That's all there is to it. Next step. Essentially, now what I want to do is I want to knock away the background. And this trick, this technique, I think I've already shown it to you once or twice, but I love this trick and I use it all the time whenever I have an object on, a fairly solid colored background. What I'm going to do is I'm going to grab my magic wand tool out of the toolbox. I'll bring my magic wand tool over top of this background, hold down Alt or Option, The minus sign appears beside the magic wand tool because, again, holding down Option or holding down Alt over on the Windows side is going to subtract from a selection, right? And the magic wand tool creates selections, or it selects based on color. And we have a nice solid background color here to work with. So I'll single click, and that essentially knocks away that background that we had inside our selection. Did you catch that? It's a really, really cool technique. It's a really cool trick. You know, I might have a situation where I have some kind of an object, maybe a product or a toy car or something like this, and it's been photographed against a drop sheet, a solid colored background. This is one technique that I might try out, right? And then, of course, once my object is selected, I can zoom out and flip over to the Move tool. Kind of the same story as before. Drag this guy over into my artwork. And what the heck are we going to use this guy for? Maybe, how about a jawline for this piece here? So I'll use my free transform, Command T or Control T. Drag that down. Kind of rotate him around a little bit. There, something like that. I'm not sure if I like that or not, but hey, what the heck. All right, Enter to lock that in. All right, let's do our flipping trick that we just saw. So I'll duplicate this guy, just kind of drop him beside him there. And then, of course, back to the Edit menu, all the way down to Transform, and then all the way down to Flip Horizontal. All right, perfect. Position them up. And that's all there is to it. So there you go. There's a couple of cool selection techniques for you that you can definitely make use of in your own work.